get started is to kind of like boost a frequency. And then if you have like one of those, like, let me see if I can open up. You know what? I'm recording on Logic. Let me see if I show you. Let me see if I could share my screen. Is it possible to share my screen once I'm already live? I'm not sure I can do this right here. Okay, but in any event, you know, just like Google graphic, you know, equalizer plugin or something, and you'll see what they look like. And you could kind of pick a band, raise it until you hear a frequency that's extremely disturbing you. Like, and so if it's a boomy frequency, it probably sounds like, and if it's like a whistle frequency, it probably sounds like, so something that's like super annoying. And those are kind of places to look out for to maybe dip out. You don't want to overdo it. At the beginning, I was way overdoing this, but that's a good way to kind of find out what's not working in the recording and kind of cleaning it up a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of go into now some of the questions that people asked me before I jumped on the call, and then we'll kind of see what else is happening in the conversation here. Okay, so Ariella asked me about signal chain for effects specifically. So it's an interesting question, like what comes first in the chain of effects? So I'm assuming she's talking about stuff like distortion, reverb, delay, anything, phasing. I have no idea what you would, you know, Ariella's a violinist, Ariella Zeitlin, she's a great violinist, so maybe she could tell me more about what she's interested in hearing about in terms of the actual effects. But the way I work in the DAW, the DAW, like I use Logic Pro, there's Pro Tools, there's Cubase, these are all examples of DAWs, would be very different than the way I would work with a pedal board, let's say on my bass if I'm playing a live gig. So that is that kind of, I'm not sure if she's asking more about the pedal board or about the DAW, but I'll kind of just explain my thought process in both. In terms of a pedal board, I guess the stuff that affects the source sound would come first, and then, you know, ambient sounds would come second or later. So I would, you know, I'll just tell my bass pedal board, it starts with the octave pedal, and then after that I have an envelope filter and then a fuzz. I don't need any ambience on a bass, but like if I change the bass signal into being something that's much more subby, then I'll affect that afterwards with the envelope filter if I want to add like a, you know, an effect to it to make it sound like a synth or something. So it's really up to you. That's kind of like whatever you want to do. But after that, I would say like the reverbs and delays would be coming after that. I don't know. There's like a debate between whether to put reverb first or delay first. It depends on your taste and what you like. But those should probably come after the manipulation of the source sound itself, right? So like you put the phaser on the guitar and then you'll send it to a delay. So in the DAW, it doesn't really work like that for me. Cheryl's asking, can I do things on GarageBand? You can absolutely do so much on GarageBand, especially the latest version is super powerful. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. Yeah, in the DAW, I'm kind of doing everything in parallel. So I'm not really worried about the signal chain like one after another usually. You know, in the signal chain, I'll have like maybe EQ and then compression on the actual track, let's say. Let's say I'm working on your violin track, so I'll probably EQ your violin. Maybe I'll compress it. Maybe I'll add a tape simulator or something to make it sound a little bit, juicier. And then I'll probably send it in parallel to a delay and to a reverb. These are auxiliary tracks. Auxiliary tracks are tracks that run in tandem with your track, but they're controlled separately. And what you do is you just send the audio to them, and they're running kind of side by side. I've talked about this a lot in lessons I've given on mixing, is that I think a lot about, you know, the audio in the mix as kind of like streams that flow into rivers, that flow into an ocean. So audio, like every track is like a stream, and auxiliary tracks are just kind of like streams that run in tandem with the track, and you're just sending water into it from it, sort of, if that makes any sense. And then, you know, you can bust them together. This is a bit more high level than getting better home recordings, is more mixing. But yeah, what I'll do is I'll send it to the delay and reverb at the exact same time. One doesn't usually go into the other. Sometimes I'll want to make a special effect where I'll have a delay that goes into a reverb, so it's a reverberated delay. So maybe I'll do something like that, but that's not typical. Usually everything is just going out at the same time in tandem to all of these different effects at once. So it's all parallel processing for me. It's not really about a signal chain for those kinds of effects. I'm going to take a sip of my beer. Okay, Mendy, he didn't actually ask me this in the thread, but he asked me this in person about pop vocal mixing. He asked me like, what's like a good way that you would probably mix a pop vocal. Now, again, every vocal is different, needs to be treated different. Every song is different within its genre. But what I told him is like a typical thing that I will do with a pop vocal, if I need it to cut and shimmer, is I'll kind of copy the track twice, or I'll copy it once. So there's two identical tracks. One, I'll put like my basic, processing on, EQ, compression, maybe some console emulation, whatever I want to do to make it sound good. And then I'll double it. And on that second track, I'll like compress the snot out of it. Dynamic compression is basically leveling out the dynamics of the audio so that it sounds more even and balanced. But you could take it too far to get a really crazy sound. And then you kind of blend that in a little bit, not all the way, so that you have a little bit of hype underneath, because compression has a sound to it. It's a whole other discussion, which is, I think, a bit beyond the scope of this. But so I'll kind of combine a super compressed sound and a very open sound, and then I will send those into a new track that is a combination of those two tracks, which will have like a little bit of slight processing on top of it. Okay, Aviva asked me about reverb. What is it and how do you use it? Aviva, if you're listening in the other room. Reverb is kind of like, so you know how delay is like an echo. If you're at a canyon and you go, hello, 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 and it comes back, that's called an echo. What a reverb is kind of the ambient sound in a room. So something that you don't actually hear the echoes, you hear a reverberation. So it's kind of like, bah, like it's more of like, you're not actually hearing the exact word, but you're hearing the space. So reverb is just a smaller space that wouldn't give you quite an echo. So every room has a reverb. Cathedrals have reverbs. Synagogues have reverbs. And most audio engineers are using reverb in music to make something sound like it's in a space. So you're giving it ambience. So that's how you use reverb. And there's different types of reverbs. There's hall reverbs, plate reverbs, room reverbs, chamber reverbs, all kinds of stuff. And you can use them for different effects to give a different kind of ambience to your track. Okay, so I had Daniel asked me about podcasting and microphone types, which I kind of addressed a little bit at the beginning. He asked me also about lavalier versus regular mics and XLR versus USB mics. I will say that if you have the availability to use a XLR microphone, it will sound much better than a USB mic. And as I was saying earlier, that condenser microphones are very sensitive and they won't help you in a bad room. They'll actually make the problems of the room worse. So most of these USB cheap microphones are condenser microphones, and they're just not going to sound very good if you don't have a good treated space. If that's all you have, then use it. And like I said earlier, you're going to want to try to like dampen out the room so it sounds as dry as possible so you have less issues. But so if you could use an XLR microphone, and I'm assuming for what you're using, a dynamic microphone would help get rid of the room and the equation. Lavalier mics, I don't have a lot of experience with, but people use them to great effect. So lavalier mics, I think, are condenser microphones, but they can be used pretty well for this kind of stuff as well. I don't really have a thought about like what the guest or the host should have. I guess if you use your best microphones and use them, make them sound as good as possible. So Cheryl asked me about GarageBand tips and best microphone, clear sound, stuff like that. GarageBand is basically like Logic, not quite Pro. It's very similar. It's got most of the main features. It's so powerful now. I didn't realize GarageBand used to be like a joke, and now you can use third-party virtual instruments like Contact or Keyscape inside of GarageBand. So you could actually get very good sounding instruments within GarageBand if you're willing to spend a bit more money on some extraneous instruments. And what they have built in is also really good and sounds good. There's no reason why you can't make good recordings with GarageBand. They have built-in effects, they have compressors, they have EQs, they have reverbs. It's all in there. I would say that if you're like getting started, you could try using the presets that they give you. You could have like a pop vocal preset and then see if it helps. And then kind of go in and tweak it and see if maybe it's compressing it too much. I mean, the best way to learn how a compressor sounds and EQ sounds is to use it. So get your feet wet, get your hands dirty, and play with the settings once you're load a preset and just play around with the EQ until it sounds better or worse, and just see what all the knobs and the things are doing, and just hear it and listen. You'll only know what a compressor sounds like if you play around with a compressor. That's the only way, you know. You compress the snot out of something, and then you'll start to understand what compression does. And then you lower the compressor until it starts to sound natural again, and then you'll hear that it's a bit more compressed than it was before. So it's all about getting your feet wet. That would be my biggest tip in terms of GarageBand. In terms of getting a good mic, like, it's all about your budget and what you're recording. If you're only doing vocals and you're in a home studio, I'd recommend getting a microphone like this, a dynamic microphone that will take a lot of the room out of the equation. If you're also doing guitar and acoustic instruments, maybe get a condenser microphone and just make sure that you're putting up as many blankets, sofas as possible. Just do whatever you have that you can deaden the room with, use that, and then, you know, whatever you can afford, the best you can afford, you'll make it work, right? Shira was asking me, I know she does voiceover work. Shira was asking me about minimizing echo and room tone, mic placement, acoustics, and the Blue Yeti. So all these things I already discussed kind of with Daniel's question. I would say if you could get a microphone that's not a Blue Yeti, I would recommend getting like a broadcast microphone and audio interface if you can afford it. And if you can't afford it, then keep using what you have. And just make sure, you know, it's hard to get rid of echo and room tone. It's like really hard to get rid of. And there are plugins that are expensive and they will help a little bit, but they don't really do the job. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the source is the number one thing. So if you have a very good source, you're not going to need to worry about getting rid of it later. If you have a bad source and all you're doing is worrying about it later, those plugins and those effects are much less powerful than having a good source. So my advice to you, Shira, would be to make your room, start with the room and make the room sound as dead and as baffled as possible so that you're not dealing with the room anymore. That's what you kind of want to do. And if you could afford an interface and a proper microphone, you'll get a better sound. I can almost guarantee it. No offense, Blue. You're a great company. Blue makes great microphones, but I'm not so into these USB mics usually. It's funny. I was there's someone in Jerusalem who has a podcast, and I don't even know. Maybe I shouldn't mention this because this story doesn't have an ending yet. But if you're starting a podcast, invest in a dynamic microphone. Forget these USB microphones. They're all condensers. They pick up all the ambience of the room. It's not worth it. You're better off buying a cheap interface and cheap dynamic microphones. It'll sound better. It'll sound clearer. It'll sound more in your face, more present. And there'll be less echo, boom, ambience that you just don't want to hear. Okay, Hannah asked me about soundproofing. Right, this is like the main thing. It's like, how do we get the room to sound good? Hannah's actually dealing with her kids in the room next door making a lot of noise. So soundproofing is a little different than acoustic treatment, right? Acoustic treatment is I could just put up a mattress and I could put up a blanket and I could put up foam and things will start to sound better and less nasty, less roomy. Soundproofing is expensive because the only way to make something soundproof is with weight. Like pure weight is the only way to do it. And so I don't know if I have a good solution for you other than to make sure the doors are super closed, put stuff in front of it, maybe put a blanket over the door before you close it. As much as you can, kind of isolate yourself from the rest of the house, that would help. But it's hard to get completely soundproofed without building like a room within a room, that kind of thing. So it's very expensive to soundproof. But if you're creative and you kind of are able to kind of separate yourself from the rest of the house, doing, like I said, closing, making sure doors are really sealed. I've had success putting a blanket over the door. I already mentioned that, but you could try that. Okay, I had another question from Michael about removing background noise. Best way to record podcasts. I think I went over all of that already. Again, try to start with the source and I would recommend dynamic microphones. Get a cheap interface and just go to town, man. And then if you have a program like GarageBand, you could really make them sound good without so much difficulty. You can make them sound decent at least, There's some things that it takes time to really learn how to mix, how to make things really sound good. And like having done it enough times, having done enough reps, to use a workout analogy, you can kind of, you understand where things are going, what's wrong about a recording. But if you are careful about your source, things will be decent enough. Jesse asked me also about getting the most out of his basic setup using also GarageBand. Let's see what he said about, placing he has like a $50 mic and how does he get it to sound good.